His retirement party was supposed to be a celebration, but for me, it became a moment of public shame. In front of everyone, my father raised his glass and called me his biggest mistake. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Riverside Community Center had never looked so elegant. White tablecloths draped every surface. Crystal glasses caught the warm light from the chandeliers. The smell of prime rib and garlic mashed potatoes filled the air. Nearly 200 people had gathered to honor Detective Lieutenant Robert Bobby, and after 35 years with the Philadelphia Police Department, I stood near the back wall, nursing a glass of lukewarm beer and watching my father work the room like the politician he'd always wanted to be. At 63, Bobby Harrison still commanded attention. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his dress uniform pressed to perfection. And that confident smile never wavered as he shook hands with commissioners, city council members, and fellow officers who'd served under his command. "There's our war hero," my Aunt Patricia whispered as she appeared beside me, nodding toward the front of the room where my father was deep in conversation with Chief Morrison. 35 years of service, and he still looks like he could chase down a suspect. I nodded politely, but the word hero stuck in my throat. To everyone else in this room, Bobby Harrison was exactly that, a decorated officer who'd cleaned up some of the city's toughest neighborhoods. A man who'd earned commendations for bravery and leadership. But to me, he was something else entirely. "You must be so proud," said Mrs. Kellerman, the elderly woman who'd lived next door to my parents for 20 years. "Your father always talked about you when he was working in the garden, said you were going to be something special." Almost choked on my beer. My father talking about me? That was news to me. "Thank you, Mrs. Kellerman. That's very kind." The microphone squealed with feedback, cutting through the conversations. Chief Morrison tapped it twice before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. It's time to honor the man of the hour." The crowd settled into their seats, and I found myself at a table near the back, with some distant cousins I barely knew. My father took the podium, adjusting his tie with the same precision he'd used to adjust his service weapon for 3 decades. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying that authoritative tone that had commanded respect in police stations and courtrooms alike. 35 years ago, I took an oath to serve and protect this city. I never imagined it would lead me to so many incredible experiences, so many lifelong friendships, and so many memories I'll treasure forever. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Someone in the front row shouted, "Tell us about the bank robbery on Broad Street." My father chuckled, holding up his hand. Now, we'd be here all night if I started telling war stories. But I will say this, every case, every arrest, every day on the job taught me something about what it means to be a man. What it means to have discipline, dedication, and most importantly, the strength to make the hard choices. He paused, scanning the room with those sharp blue eyes that had intimidated suspects and subordinates for decades. When his gaze briefly met mine, I felt that familiar chill, the same one I'd felt as a child when I'd disappointed him. I've been blessed with a successful career, wonderful colleagues, and a community that supported me through thick and thin. But like any man, I've had my share of challenges. Some professional, some personal. The room grew quieter. This wasn't the lighthearted retirement speech anyone had expected. "I want to talk about something that's been on my mind lately," he continued, his voice growing more serious. "The importance of legacy, what we leave behind, the mark we make on this world." He reached for his water glass, took a sip, and then looked directly at me. "I've always been a man who believes in speaking the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's not what people want to hear. And tonight I want to be honest with all of you about something that's been weighing on my heart." My stomach dropped. Something about his tone, the way he was building up to this moment, felt wrong. Very wrong. 35 years ago, I became a police officer. 28 years ago, I became a father. And if I'm being completely honest with you with myself, I have to say that becoming a father was the biggest mistake of my life. The words hit the room like a physical blow. I heard someone gasp. A fork clattered against a plate. A comfortable murmur of conversation died instantly. But my father wasn't finished. "I know that sounds harsh," he continued, his voice steady and unapologetic. "But hear me out. I dedicated my life to upholding the law, to serving justice, to being a pillar of strength in this community. I sacrificed weekends, holidays, family time, all, in service of something greater than myself, and I'm proud of that sacrifice." Looked directly at me again, and I felt every eye in the room following his gaze. But raising a child, my child, required a different kind of strength, a softer kind. And I'm afraid that's not the man I am. No, I'm a man of action, of discipline, of consequences. I believe in earning respect, not expecting it. I believe in standing on your own 2 feet, not relying on others to carry you. The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, my face flushing with a combination of humiliation and rage. "My son Daniel is a good man," my father continued, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I knew so well. "He's got a kind heart, and I'm sure he'll find his way eventually. But I have to admit, I've always wondered what kind of man he might have become if he'd had a father who was better suited for the job. Someone who could have taught him the discipline and drive that I tried and apparently failed to instill." Few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. I caught sight of my cousin Michael staring at me with a mixture of pity and horror. I tell you this not to hurt anyone, but because I believe in the truth. And the truth is, sometimes our greatest failures teach us the most about ourselves. My failure as a father taught me that not every man is meant for every job. I was meant to be a police officer. I was meant to serve this community. But I was not meant to be the kind of father that a sensitive child needed. He raised his glass, that same confident smile returning to his face. "So tonight I want to toast to the lessons learned, the mistakes made, the wisdom that comes from acknowledging our limitations. To 35 years of service, and to the clarity that comes from finally speaking the truth aloud." The room remained frozen for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, awkwardly, a few people began to raise their glasses, not enthusiastically. Not with the celebration that had filled the room moments before, but with the kind of polite compliance that comes from not knowing what else to do. I sat there, my hands clenched so tightly around my beer glass that I was surprised it didn't shatter. Every eye in the room had looked at me during his speech. Every person in that room now knew that Detective Lieutenant Bobby Harrison considered his only son to be his greatest failure. The applause that followed was scattered and uncomfortable. People seemed to be clapping more out of obligation than approval, and the conversations that resumed were hushed and urgent. I could hear fragments of whispered words. "I can't believe he said that, that poor boy. What was he thinking?" But I barely heard any of it. All I could focus on was the blood pounding in my ears and the overwhelming urge to either disappear entirely or stand up and tell everyone in that room exactly what kind of father Bobby Harrison had really been. Instead, I did what I'd always done when faced with my father's disappointment. I sat there, took it, tried to figure out how to get through the rest of the evening without completely falling apart. That's when I noticed Mayor Patricia Hawkins rising from her seat at the head table, her expression unreadable as she walked toward the podium where my father was still basking in the uncomfortable aftermath of his honest speech. Something about the way she moved, the determination in her stride, made me think that this evening was far from over. Mayor Patricia Hawkins commanded attention without saying a word. At 52, she had the kind of presence that came from 20 years of municipal politics and the confidence of someone who'd never lost an election. Her navy blue suit was immaculate, her silver hair pulled back in a style that was both professional and elegant, and when she walked, people noticed. The room fell silent as she approached the podium. My father, still holding his glass of champagne, looked surprised but pleased. Having the mayor speak at his retirement party would be the perfect capstone to his speech of validation from the city's highest office. "Bobby," she said, her voice carrying easily through the microphone, "that was quite a speech." He smiled, that same self-satisfied expression he'd worn after delivering what he clearly considered profound wisdom. "Thank you, Madam Mayor, I believe." In honesty, even when it's difficult. Yes, she replied, turning to face the crowd. Honesty is important. In fact, I think this is the perfect time for some honesty. Something in her tone made my father's smile falter slightly. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Ladies and gentlemen, I've known Bobby Harrison for 15 years, ever since I was first elected to City Council. He's been a dedicated officer, and his service record speaks for itself. But tonight, after hearing his speech, I think there's another story that needs to be told. My father stepped closer to the microphone. Madam Mayor, I'm not sure what you're... The story of Daniel Harrison, she continued, her voice growing stronger. A young man who, despite what his father just told you, has been quietly making a difference in our city for the past 5 years. I felt my heart stop. How did she know anything about what I'd been doing? Daniel, would you please stand up? Every head in the room turned toward me. I felt like I was drowning in attention. But something about the mayor's tone, firm but kind, made me push back my chair and rise to my feet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 5 years ago, Mayor Hawkins continued, when we were facing a crisis with our youth outreach programs, when city funding was cut and we were about to lose 3 community centers in South Philadelphia, a young man walked into my office with a proposal. My mouth went dry. She was talking about the night I'd shown up at City Hall with a folder full of grant applications and a plan to save the Hartwell Community Center. I'd worked for weeks on that proposal, staying up until 3 in the morning, researching federal programs and private foundations. This young man had spent months of his own time using his own resources to research funding opportunities. He'd identified 17 different grants and had already begun the application process. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want publicity. He just wanted to help kids in his neighborhood have a safe place to go after school. I could see my father's face from across the room. The confident smile was completely gone now, replaced by confusion and something that might have been concerning. That proposal, the mayor continued, resulted in over $200,000 in funding that saved not just 1 community center, but 3, and that was just the beginning. She turned to look directly at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Genuine pride. Over the past 5 years, Daniel Harrison has coordinated volunteer efforts that have provided over 15,000 meals to homeless individuals. He's organized clothing drives that have outfitted hundreds of families. He's tutored at-risk youth, helped seniors with their taxes, and somehow managed to do all of this while working full-time and never once asking for recognition. The room was completely silent now. I could hear the air conditioning humming, the distant sound of traffic outside, and my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Last winter, during the water main break on Carlton Street, when 37 families were displaced from their homes, Daniel spent 3 days coordinating temporary housing, food, and emergency supplies. He slept in his car for 2 nights to make sure every family had what they needed. I remembered that weekend. The water main had burst during a particularly brutal cold snap, and the apartment building's heating system had failed. News coverage, and couldn't stop thinking about the kids who'd lost their warm beds in the middle of winter. Daniel, the mayor said, looking directly at me. In my 15 years in municipal government, I have never worked with anyone elected, official, department head, or volunteer who has demonstrated more consistent compassion and effectiveness than you have. My father was staring at me now with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the disappointment I was used to, not the patronizing tolerance, but something closer to bewilderment. The young man who his father just described as his biggest mistake, Mayor Hawkins continued, is the same person who last month organized a blood drive that collected over 300 units during a critical shortage. He's the same person who spent his vacation days helping elderly residents evacuate during the flood warnings. He's the same person who has quietly, without fanfare, been making our city a better place to live, letting her words sink. I have a confession to make, she said. 2 months ago, our city council voted to create a new position, director of community outreach. It's a paid position with full benefits, and it comes with a budget of $500,000. To expand the programs that have been making such a difference in our neighborhoods. My legs felt weak. Where was this going? We interviewed dozens of candidates, people with advanced degrees, people with years of experience in nonprofit management, people with impressive resumes and strong references. But in the end, the choice was obvious. We wanted to offer the position to the person who had already been doing the job and doing it better than anyone we could have imagined. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. Daniel, I was planning to call you next week to formally offer you the position. But after tonight, after what I've witnessed here, I think this is the perfect time to make it official. The room erupted in murmurs. I heard someone say, "Oh my God," and another voice whispered, "This is incredible." Daniel Harrison, Mayor, Hawkins said, her voice ringing with authority. On behalf of the city of Philadelphia, I would like to offer you the position of Director of Community Outreach, effective immediately. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what was happening. A job offer, a real job, with a title and a salary and benefits. Recognition for work I'd been doing in silence for years, but more than that, vindication. In front of everyone who'd just heard my father call me his biggest mistake, the mayor of Philadelphia was offering me a position of leadership and trust. The salary is $68,000 annually, she continued, with full health benefits and a retirement plan. Your office will be in City Hall, and you'll be working directly with my administration to expand community programs throughout the city. My father stepped forward, his face pale. Madam Mayor, I had no idea that Daniel was involved in any of this. She turned to look at him, and her expression was polite but cool. That's interesting, Bobby. Daniel has been listed as the primary contact on every grant application, every volunteer coordination effort, and every community outreach initiative for the past 5 years. His name is on dozens of official city documents. He's attended city council meetings, testified before committees, and worked directly with my staff on numerous occasions. The implication hung in the air like smoke. If Daniel's name was on all these official documents, if he'd been working with the mayor's office for years, then his father's claim of not knowing about any of it said something profound about how little attention he'd been paying to his son's life. Oh, Daniel, Mayor Hawkins said, turning back to me with a warm smile. You don't have to answer tonight. Take some time to think about it. But I hope you'll consider accepting. Philadelphia needs leaders like you people who see problems and solve them, who help others without expecting anything in return, who make their community stronger through quiet acts of service. She walked over to where I was standing and handed me the envelope. This contains the official job offer and all the details. But more importantly, it contains something else's letter of recommendation from every city council member, every department head you've worked with, and every community leader who has benefited from your efforts. 43 letters, Daniel. 43 people who wanted to tell you how much your work has meant to them. I took the envelope with trembling hands. It felt heavier than paper should feel, weighted with possibilities I'd never imagined. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Hawkins announced to the room. I give you Daniel Harrison, not his father's biggest mistake, but one of Philadelphia's greatest assets. The applause started slowly, then built to something thunderous. People were standing, clapping. I could see tears in some eyes. Mrs. Kellerman was beaming at me like I'd just won the Nobel Prize. But the person I found myself looking at was my father, who stood frozen beside the podium, his retirement. Speech suddenly forgotten, staring at his son like he was seeing him for the first time. The applause died down, but the energy in the room remained electric. People were clustering around tables, animated conversations breaking out as they processed what they'd just witnessed. I stood there, still holding the envelope from Mayor Hawkins, watching my father navigate through well-wishers, who were now torn between congratulating him on his retirement and asking about his son's remarkable achievements. Chief Morrison was the first to reach us, his weathered face split by a genuine grin. Bobby, you've been holding out on us. Your son's been running half the city's community programs. Why didn't you ever mention any of this? My father's jaw worked silently for a moment. We don't talk much about work at home, he finally managed. Work? The chief laughed. This isn't work. This is calling. Your boy's got the heart of a public servant. Reminds me of you when you first started on the force, always wanting to fix everything. The comparison seemed to hit my father like cold water. He glanced at me, then back at the chief. I suppose I never saw it that way. Where people approached, city council members I'd worked with on various projects, volunteers from the community, centers, even some of the families I'd helped during emergencies. Each conversation drove home the same point. I had been living an entire professional life that my father knew nothing about. Daniel coordinated our entire holiday toy drive last year. Mrs. Rodriguez from the Hartwell Center was telling anyone who would listen. 1,500 toys for underprivileged kids. Organized the whole thing from his kitchen table. He got my grandson into the summer reading program, added Mr. Chen. An elderly man I'd helped with his Medicare paperwork. That boy was failing school, but Daniel found him a tutor and got him excited about books. Now he's on the honor roll. Each story was like another brick being removed from the wall my father had built around his perception of me. I watched his face change with every revelation, confusion giving way to something that might have been recognition, though he was fighting hard against it. The crowd eventually began to thin as people said their goodbyes, but not before dozens of them had approached me personally. Some thanked me for specific help I'd provided. Others expressed excitement about my new position. A few mentioned programs. They hoped the city would consider funding by the time the last guests were leaving. Only family remained. My Aunt Patricia had tears in her eyes as she hugged me. "Honey, I had no idea you were doing all this. Why didn't you ever tell us?" Shrugged, suddenly feeling exhausted. It didn't seem like something to brag about. Brag about? She looked incredulous. "Daniel, you've been changing people's lives. That's not bragging. That's sharing good news." My cousin Michael clapped me on the shoulder. "Dude, you're like a secret superhero or something. All these years I thought you were just, I don't know, figuring things out." "I was figuring things out," I said. This is what I figured out. As the family members filtered out into the parking lot, making plans for coffee next weekend and promising to call soon, I found myself alone in the community center with my father. The cleaning crew was already setting up their equipment, but they were giving us space to finish our conversation. Dad stood near the head table, methodically stacking chairs with the precision he brought to everything. It was a habit from his police days, always leave a place better than you found it. But tonight, the familiar actions seemed almost desperate, like he was trying to impose order on a situation that had spiraled completely out of his control. "So," he said without looking at me, "Director of Community Outreach. So it seems, 68,000 a year?" That's what she said. He finished stacking the last chair and turned to face me. In the harsh fluorescent light of the nearly empty hall, he looked older than he had during his speech. The confidence that had carried him through 35 years of police work seemed to have evaporated. "I never knew," he said quietly. "Did I?" "No. 5 years of ... all of that. The grants, the volunteering, the programs. How did I not know?" I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. The same feeling I'd gotten as a child when he'd asked me questions that felt like traps. "You never asked?" "I asked about your job. You said you were doing data entry for an insurance company." "I was. That's how I paid my bills. But that's not all I was doing." He ran a hand through his silver hair, messing up the perfect styling for the first time all evening. "When did you start?" "The community work, I mean? Remember when Mom died?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't soften it. "The heart attack? When she was 51? You went back to work 3 days after the funeral?" His face tightened. Work was how I dealt with it. I needed structure, routine. I needed my father. The words hung between us like a challenge. "But you were gone 14 hours a day, and when you were home, you didn't want to talk about her. You didn't want to talk about anything that reminded you she was gone." "Daniel, so I went to the community center where she used to volunteer, the Hartwell Center on Thursday nights, helping kids with homework. I thought maybe if I went there, I'd feel closer to her." His face went pale. "I didn't know she volunteered there." "She volunteered there for 8 years, Dad. Every Thursday night. She used to tell you about it at dinner, about the kids she was helping, the programs they were running, the families that needed support. You said it was nice and changed the subject." The words were coming faster now, years of silence breaking open like a dam. "After she died, I kept going back. At first because it made me feel connected to her, but then because I realized I was good at it. I understood what those kids needed because I'd been one of them, a kid whose parents were too wrapped up in other things to really see him. Not fair, isn't it? I pulled out one of the remaining chairs and sat down, suddenly feeling the weight of the entire evening. Dad, when was the last time you asked me about my life? Not my job, not whether I was paying my bills, but my actual life. What I cared about, what I was working toward, what made me happy. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched between us. Tonight, I continued, you stood up in front of 200 people and called me your biggest mistake. You talked about my lack of discipline and drive. But for 5 years, I've been working 60-hour weeks, 40 at my day job, and 20 more organizing programs that have helped thousands of people. The mayor of Philadelphia just offered me a leadership position based on work I've been doing in my spare time. I didn't know, he repeated, but his voice was smaller now. You didn't? No, because you didn't want to know. Knowing would have meant admitting that maybe your way of seeing me was wrong. Maybe the sensitive child you were so disappointed in had actually turned into someone worth being proud of. He sank into a chair across from me, the fight going. Out of him, your mother always said you had a good heart. Mom saw me. She asked questions and listened to the answers. She celebrated my successes and helped me through my failures. She made me feel like I mattered, and I didn't. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. You made me feel like I was always falling short of some standard I could never understand. Like being compassionate was a weakness instead of a strength. Like caring about other people was somehow less important than advancing your career or maintaining your reputation. The cleaning crew had finished setting up and was waiting for us to leave. My father stood up slowly, looking every one of his. 63 years. I was wrong, he said finally. About tonight, about the speech, about ... a lot of things. Yeah, I said, standing up as well. You were. We walked toward the exit in silence, our footsteps echoing in the empty hall. At the door, he stopped. The job offer, he said. Are you going to take it? I looked at him, this man who had shaped so much of my life through his absence as much as his presence. I think so. It's time I stopped hiding what I'm capable of. He nodded slowly. Your mother would be proud. I know she would. ... He started, then stopped, struggling with words that seemed to stick in his throat. I should have been paying attention. I should have known who my son really was. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was acknowledgement, and after 28 years, that felt like a start. We stepped out into the cool night air, and I realized that everything had changed. Not just because of the job offer or the public vindication, but because for the first time in my adult life, my father had been forced to see me as I actually was, instead of as he'd imagined me to be. The question now was what we were going to do with that knowledge. 3 days after the retirement party, I was sitting in my cramped apartment kitchen, spreading the contents of Mayor Hawkins's envelope across my table. The job offer was more comprehensive than I'd imagined: detailed benefit packages, description of my future office space, and a start date just 2 weeks away. But it was the 43 letters of recommendation that kept drawing my attention, each. One told a different story about work I'd done, families I'd helped, problems I'd solved. Reading them felt surreal, like discovering that I'd been living a double life without realizing it. Mrs. Patterson from the South Philly Food Bank wrote about how I'd reorganized their entire distribution system, cutting wait times in half. Councilman Torres detailed my role in securing funding for after-school programs that now served over 300 kids. The most surprising letter came from Detective Sarah Walsh, someone I'd never heard of. She wrote about how my work with at-risk youth had prevented several kids from getting involved with gangs, ultimately reducing juvenile crime rates in 3 neighborhoods. She specifically mentioned Marcus Thompson, 16-year-old who'd been heading toward serious trouble before I'd gotten him into a mentorship program. I remembered Marcus angry, intelligent, full of potential that he didn't know how to channel. Working with him had reminded me of myself at that age, though my rebellion had been quieter, more internal. Instead of acting out, I'd simply withdrawn. accepting my father's assessment that I was disappointing and trying to make peace with. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Daniel, this is Detective Walsh. Could we meet for coffee? I have something important to discuss regarding your father." Sarah, the message made my stomach tighten. What could a detective want to discuss about my father that couldn't be said over the phone? Why now, just days after his retirement? Party had gone so spectacularly off the rails. We met at Sullivan's Diner on Broad Street, a place that served strong coffee and minded its own business. Detective Walsh was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with short auburn hair, and the kind of alert eyes that came from years of police work. She was already seated in a corner booth when I arrived, nursing a cup of black coffee and studying a manila folder. "Daniel Harrison." She stood to shake my hand. "Sarah Walsh. Thank you for meeting me on short notice. Your letter mentioned you knew about my work with at-risk youth. I wasn't aware that I was working with police programs." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You weren't directly. But several kids you mentored ended up crossing paths with my cases. Every time they'd mention this guy Daniel who'd helped them find better options. When I started tracking the pattern, your name kept coming up." We sat down, and she opened the folder. Inside were photographs, police reports, and what looked like court documents. "I asked to meet because of something that happened at your father's retirement party. Word travels fast in the department, and what the mayor said about your community work got people talking, including some people who've been waiting along. Time to have a conversation about your father." The coffee suddenly tastes bitter. What kind of conversation? The kind that's been impossible to have while he was still active duty? The kind that requires someone with credibility in the community? Someone like you to understand the full picture. She pulled out a photograph showing a run-down apartment building. "Do you recognize this place?" I studied it carefully. "It's the Carlton Arms on South Street. That's where the water main broke last winter. I help coordinate housing for the displaced families. Right, what you probably don't know is that this building has been a problem for 15 years. Slumlord Vincent Torino owns it, along with 12 other properties in South Philly. Code violations, safety issues, rent gouging, you name it." She showed me another document. Every time tenants tried to organize, every time they called in. Violations. Every time they attempted legal action, the complaints mysteriously disappeared or got buried in bureaucracy. For 15 years, families lived in dangerous conditions because someone in the system was protecting Torino. My mouth went dry. What does this have to do with my father? Your father was the supervising officer for that district for 8 years. Any serious complaints about housing violations? Any patterns of criminal activity related to property management? Those reports crossed his desk. She pulled out a stack of police reports, all with my father's signature. Domestic disturbance. Calls to Torino's buildings. Drug activity complaints. Reports of children being injured due to unsafe conditions. All of them marked unfounded or unable to substantiate. You're saying my father was covering for this Torino guy? I'm saying that's what it looks like from the outside. But here's where it gets complicated. She showed me a bank record. 3 months after your father retired, Vincent Torino was arrested. We'd been building a case against him for 2 years, but we needed someone with inside knowledge of how the system had been manipulated. The record showed a series of large cash deposits to an account in my father's name payments that corresponded exactly with dates when major complaints against Torino had been dismissed. Jesus Christ. The words escaped before I could stop them. Your father's been taking money to look the other way while families lived in squalor. Some of those families you helped during the water main break, they'd been fighting for decent housing for years, and your father made sure their voices were never heard. I stared at the documents, trying to process what I was seeing. The man who'd spent his retirement speech talking about discipline, service, and doing the right thing had been systematically protecting a criminal who endangered children. Why are you showing me this? Because we need your help. Torino's case goes to trial next month, and his defense strategy is going to be that he was operating with police approval. He's going to claim that if officers like your father were signing off on his buildings, then he had no reason to believe he was doing anything wrong. She leaned forward. We need someone who can testify about the impact of Torino's negligence. Someone who worked directly with the affected families, who can speak to the human cost of what happened. Someone the jury will trust. You want me? To testify against my father. I want you to testify for the families you helped. Your father's actions or lack of action will come out in the trial whether you testify or not. But your testimony about what you witnessed, what you did to help people he failed to protect, could be the difference between justice and letting Torino walk free. I pushed the photographs away, suddenly feeling sick. I need time to process. This, of course. But Daniel? She gathered up the documents and closed the folder. I've read about your community work. You spent 5 years trying to help people who fell through the cracks in the system. This is your chance to help fix the system itself. After she left, I sat in the diner for another hour, drinking terrible coffee and staring out the window at the city I'd been trying to serve. Everything I thought I understood about my father was shifting again. It wasn't just that he'd been emotionally absent or disappointed in me. He'd been actively corrupt, taking money to ignore the suffering of the very people I'd been trying to help, the families I'd assisted during the water main break, families who'd lost their homes because of faulty plumbing in buildings that should have been condemned years ago, were victims of my father's greed as much as Torino's negligence. When I finally made it home, there was a voicemail waiting for my father. His voice sounded tired, older than it had just a few days ago. Daniel, it's Dad. I've been thinking about what we talked about the other night. It's about your mother, about the things I missed, about a lot of things. So I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner this weekend, just the two of us. There are some things I think we need to discuss. I deleted the message without listening to it again. Whatever my father wanted to discuss, it couldn't be worse than what I'd just learned. But it might be connected. The question was whether I was ready to hear more truths that would shatter what little remained of the man I'd spent 28 years trying to understand. I looked at the job offer still spread across my kitchen table. Then at my phone with Detective Walsh's contact information. 2 paths forward, both leading toward a version of myself I'd never imagined. One thing was certain. The retirement party had been just the beginning. The real reckoning was still to come. I spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with Detective Walsh's revelation before finally agreeing to meet my father for dinner. We chose Giordano's, a small Italian restaurant in South Philadelphia that we'd gone to exactly twice in my entire life, once for my high school graduation and once after my mother's funeral. It seemed fitting somehow, a place where we'd marked endings. He was already seated when I arrived, wearing a navy polo shirt and khakis, the casual uniform of retirement. Without his police uniform, he looked smaller, more ordinary. Just another aging man having dinner alone until his son showed up. Daniel. He stood to shake my hand, a gesture that felt awkward and formal. Thank you for coming. Thanks for dinner. I slid into the booth across from him, noting how he'd chosen a corner table away from other diners. Either he valued privacy, or he sensed this conversation might not go smoothly. We ordered pasta for him, chicken parmigiana for me and maid. Small talk about the weather, my new job, and his adjustment to retirement. But underneath the polite conversation, I could feel him building towards something bigger. His fingers drummed against the table, a nervous habit I'd noticed during my childhood, whenever he was working up to delivering bad news. I've been doing a lot of thinking since the retirement party, he finally said, after the waitress brought our salads. About what you said, about how I never asked about your life, about how I missed so much. It's in the past now, is it? He set down his fork and looked directly at me, because I don't think it is. I think the past has a way of catching up with you, especially when you've been running from it for as long as I have. Something in his tone triggered an alarm in my chest. This wasn't going to be a simple apology dinner. I need to tell you something, he continued. Something I should have told you years ago, but I was too proud, too scared, too... ... double quotes he trailed off, searching for words. Too ashamed. I waited, thinking about the documents Detective Walsh had shown me, wondering if he somehow knew about the investigation. Your mother didn't die of a heart attack? The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the color drain from my face. What? She died of a heart attack, yes, but that's not the whole truth. He was gripping his water glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. She killed herself, Daniel. She took pills, a lot of pills, and she called me before she did it. The restaurant around us seemed to fade into background noise. No, that's not. The doctors said it was a heart attack. There was an autopsy. The pills caused the heart attack, and I knew people who could make sure the official cause of death didn't raise questions. People who owed me favors. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You covered up Mom's suicide? I covered it up to protect you. We're 23, just starting your life. I didn't want you to carry the burden of knowing. She chose to leave us. She chose to leave you. The words came out louder than I intended, and a couple at a nearby table glanced over. I lowered my voice. What did you do to her? His face crumpled. I was having an affair. Had been for 2 years, she found out. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The woman at your retirement party, Detective Martinez from the narcotics unit? That's her, isn't it? He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. Carmen and I. It started during a joint investigation. Working late nights, the stress of the job, and your mother and I had been growing apart for years, so you decided to find someone else instead of trying to fix your marriage. It wasn't supposed to happen. It just ... did. And when your mother confronted me about it, I told her I'd end it. I promised I'd never see Carmen again, but you didn't. No, I didn't. He was staring down at his untouched salad. Your mother hired a private investigator. She had photographs, hotel receipts, credit card statements. She had everything. I thought about my mother in those final months. How quiet she'd become, how she'd stopped volunteering at the community center, how she'd seemed to fade a little more each day. I'd attributed it to empty nest syndrome, to the natural sadness of middle age. I'd never imagined she was falling apart while I lived in my own apartment across town, oblivious. The night she died, he continued, she called me at the station. She said she couldn't live with the humiliation anymore. She said she was tired of pretending everything was fine, tired of watching me lie to everyone about who I really was. And you didn't try to stop her? I thought she was being dramatic. Your mother was always emotional, always threatening to leave when we fought. I told her we'd talk when I got home from work. His voice broke. By the time I got there, it was too late. I pushed my plate away, suddenly nauseated. So while I was grieving what I thought was a sudden, tragic loss, you knew she'd killed herself because of your cheating, and you were continuing to sleep with the woman who drove her to suicide. Daniel, did you marry her? The question came out like a knife thrust. Detective Martinez. Did you marry her? His silence was answer enough. When? 2 years ago. Quietly. Just a courthouse ceremony. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. 2 years ago, while I was organizing community programs and volunteering at the center where Mom used to work, you were playing house with your girlfriend. It wasn't like that. What was it like? I leaned forward, anger building in my chest like pressure in a boiler. Explain to me what it was like, Dad, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you killed my mother, covered it up, and then moved on with your life like nothing happened.
Oh.
I didn't kill her. You killed her marriage. You killed her trust. You killed her hope. And when she couldn't live with what you'd done to her, you made sure no one would ever know the truth. He was crying now, tears running down his cheeks into his pasta. I've lived with this guilt for 5 years. Every day. Wondering if I'd made different choices. If I'd been a better husband. If you'd been a better person. I corrected. But here's what I don't understand. Why tell me now? Why ruin the carefully constructed lie you've been living? He wiped his eyes with his napkin. Because I'm dying, Daniel. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. I have maybe 6 months. The restaurant seemed to tilt around me. What? That's why I retired early. That's why I wanted to fix things between us. I don't have time left to keep carrying these secrets. I sat back in the booth, overwhelmed by the cascade of revelations. My father was dying. My mother had committed suicide. The woman responsible was now my stepmother. And this was just the beginning of what I suspected were much deeper truths. There's more, isn't there? I said quietly. This isn't just about Mom and your affair. There are other things you need to tell me. His face went pale. What do you mean? I pulled out my phone and showed him Detective Walsh's contact information. I mean that your retirement party attracted more attention than you realized? Kind of attention from people who've been waiting for you to leave the force, so they could finally ask some difficult questions. He stared at the phone screen like it was a loaded gun. Sarah Walsh, Internal Affairs. Actually, she's with Financial Crimes now, and she's very interested in discussing your relationship with Vincent Torino. The last bit of color drained from his face. He looked like he might be sick. So here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice steady despite the chaos in my head. You're going to tell me everything. About Torino, about the bribes, about every family you failed to protect while you were taking money to look the other way. And then you're going to help me figure out how to make this right. Daniel, you don't understand. I understand that while I was spending my weekends helping families find safe housing, we're being paid to keep them trapped in dangerous buildings. I understand that the water main break that displaced 37 families happened because you prevented proper inspections for years. I leaned across the table. What I don't understand is how the man who raised me to believe in right and wrong could spend his career doing the exact opposite. He sat there, defeated, looking at every one of his 63 years plus the weight of his crimes. How much? I asked. How much did Torino pay you? It's over 8 years? About $200,000? The number hit me like another physical blow. While families struggled in substandard housing, while children got sick from mold and lead, paint, while elderly tenants lived in fear of eviction, my father had been building a nest egg from their suffering. Jesus Christ, Dad, do you have any idea what I could have done with that money? The programs I could have funded, the families I could have helped? I know. Do you? Because right now you're going to find out that money is going to be returned, with interest, to every family Torino exploited. And you're going to testify against him, even if it means admitting your own crimes. He looked up at me with something that might have been surprising. You want me to confess? I want you to. Do the right thing for once in your life, before it's too late. The waitress approached with our entrees, took one look at our faces, and quietly retreated. We sat in silence for a long moment. The weight of 28 years of lies and half-truths settling between us like debris from an explosion. Finally, he spoke. If I testify, I'll go to prison. Probably for the rest of whatever life I have left. Good, I said. Maybe that's where you belong. The courtroom was packed on the morning of Vincent Torino's trial. I sat in the witness section, watching as prosecutors laid out their case against the slumlord, who had terrorized South Philadelphia families for over a decade. Detective Walsh sat 2 rows behind me, occasionally catching my eye with an encouraging nod. The families I'd helped during the water main break filled the gallery, the Rodriguezes, the Chunes, the Washingtons, all waiting to see if justice would finally be served. My father hadn't spoken to me since our dinner at Giordano's 3 weeks earlier. After I'd demanded he'd confess and testify, he'd simply stood up, threw $40 on the table, and walked out without another word. I'd spent the following days wondering if I'd pushed too hard, if I'd destroyed what little relationship we had left, but then Detective Walsh called with news that changed everything. Your father came in yesterday, she'd said over the phone. He wants to make a deal. The deal was comprehensive and damning. In exchange for full cooperation and testimony against Torino, my father would plead guilty to corruption charges and serve 18 months in minimum security prison. Given his terminal diagnosis, it was likely he'd served less than a year before, being released on compassionate grounds. More importantly, he'd agreed to forfeit all assets purchased with bribe money, including the house he'd bought for Carmen, his second wife. But the most shocking part of his confession had nothing to do with Torino. There were others, Detective Walsh had explained during our pre-trial meeting. Your father wasn't just taking money from one slumlord. He was part of a network of corrupt officers who were systematically protecting property crimes, drug operations, and even human trafficking in exchange for regular payments. The scope of the corruption was staggering. For nearly a decade, a group of senior officers had been operating what amounted to a protection racket, taking payments from criminals in exchange for burying investigations, losing evidence, and intimidating Witnesses. My father had been one of the ringleaders. How much money are we talking about? I'd asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Conservative estimate. Your father personally received over $500,000 in bribes. The network as a whole probably moved several million. The number had left me speechless. While I'd been scraping together grant money to fund community programs, my father had been earning more in illegal payments than most people made in legitimate careers. Now, sitting in the courtroom, I watched as prosecutor Janet Morrison began her opening statement. She was a thin woman in her 40s, with steel gray hair, and the kind of focused intensity that came from years of putting dangerous people behind bars. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, over the next several days, you're going to hear testimony about a systematic pattern of corruption that endangered the lives of hundreds of families in our city. You're going to learn about police officers who swore to protect and serve, but instead chose to protect criminals and serve their own financial interests. She gestured toward Torino, a heavy-set man in his 50s who sat at the defendant's table looking defiant despite the mountain of evidence against him. Vincent Torino owned 14 properties in South Philadelphia. These weren't luxury apartments or well-maintained homes. These were buildings with faulty wiring, broken heating systems, lead paint, and structural damage that made them unsafe. For human habitation, buildings where children got sick from mold exposure, where elderly tenants died during heat waves because their air conditioning had been broken for months, where families lived in constant fear of eviction if they complained about conditions. The prosecutor's voice grew stronger as she continued. But Vincent Torino didn't maintain these properties as death traps out of ignorance or negligence. He did it because he knew he could get away with it. He knew that every time tenants filed complaints, every time city inspectors tried to investigate, every time legal action was threatened, certain police officers would make those problems disappear. She picked up a thick folder from her table. This folder contains over 300 incident reports, inspection requests, and formal complaints related to Mr. Torino's properties. Reports of domestic violence calls that were mysteriously downgraded. Reports of drug activity that were filed as unfounded. Reports of dangerous living conditions that somehow never made it to the appropriate city departments. Morrison walked closer to the jury box. And how did these reports disappear? Through the systematic corruption of police officers who were paid substantial sums to ensure that Vincent Torino never faced consequences for the suffering he caused. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. One of those officers was Detective Lieutenant Robert Harrison, a 35-year veteran of the Philadelphia Police Department. Over the course of this trial, you will hear Lieutenant Harrison's own testimony about how he accepted bribes, buried investigations, and protected Mr. Torino's criminal enterprise. A murmur went through the courtroom. Despite Detective Walsh's preparation, hearing my father's name spoken aloud in this context still felt surreal. But this case isn't just about corruption, Morrison continued. It's about the human cost of that corruption. You will hear from families who lived in fear, from children who got sick, from elderly tenants who suffered in silence because they believed the system had abandoned them. She looked directly at me. And you will hear from community members who spent their own time and resources trying to help the victims of Mr. Torino's negligence, people who saw the suffering that resulted from this conspiracy of silence and chose to act. The defense attorney, a well-dressed man named Richardson, gave a predictably different version of events during his opening statement. He painted Torino as a hard-working businessman who relied on police guidance about which complaints were legitimate. He suggested that if officers like my father had signed off on his properties, then Torino had every reason to believe he was operating within the law. It was a clever strategy, but it fell apart as soon as the prosecution began presenting evidence. The first witness was Maria Santos, a young mother who had lived in one of Torino's buildings with her 2 children. She testified about ceiling leaks that caused chunks of plaster to fall into her baby's crib.
Ow!
About electrical problems that regularly caused power outages, about a heating system that hadn't worked properly in 3 years. I called the police 5 times, she said, her voice barely audible even with the microphone. Every time, they said they would send someone to investigate, but no one ever came. When I called to follow up, they said there was no record of my complaints. Under cross-examination, Richardson tried to suggest that Maria was an unreliable tenant who had fallen behind on rent payments. But Morrison quickly established that Maria had never missed a rent payment and had documented every interaction with police through photographs and written records. The second witness was James Washington, an elderly man who had lived in another Torino property for 8 years. He testified about windows that wouldn't close properly, leaving his apartment freezing in winter, about a bathroom ceiling that had collapsed, flooding his bedroom and destroying his belongings, about repeated promises from building management that repairs would be made, promises that were never kept. I went to the police station in person, he said, his voice stronger than Maria's, but filled with frustration. I brought photographs of the damage, copies of my lease, documentation of every conversation I'd had with the landlord. The officer who met with me was Lieutenant Harrison. Morrison approached the witness stand. What did Lieutenant Harrison tell you, Mr. Washington? He said that landlord-tenant disputes were a civil matter, not a criminal one. He said the police couldn't get involved unless there was evidence of criminal activity. Did you show him photographs of the collapsed ceiling? Yes, ma'am, I showed him everything. And what was his response? James Washington looked directly at me, his eyes filled with a sadness that cut through me like a blade. He said that old buildings have problems and that if I didn't like the conditions, I should find somewhere else to live. The testimony continued for 3 days. Witness after witness described the same pattern: complaints filed, promises made, investigations that never happened. Each story was a small tragedy, a family or individual who had been failed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. On the 4th day, Detective Walsh took the stand to present the financial evidence. She methodically detailed the payments from Torino to my father, showing bank records, cash deposits, and even photographs of my father meeting with Torino in restaurants and parking lots. Lieutenant Harrison received his first payment from Vincent Torino in March 2018, she testified. $5,000 in cash, deposited into a savings account under his wife's name. His wife's name? Morrison asked. Carmen Martinez, Harrison. She was also a police officer working in the narcotics division. The revelation that my father's new wife had also been involved in the corruption sent another wave of murmurs through the courtroom. I felt sick, realizing that even his affair had been contaminated by criminal activity. Walsh continued her testimony, showing how the payments had increased over time as my father proved his willingness to protect Torino's interests. By 2023, he was receiving monthly payments of $3,000, plus bonuses for handling specific problems. What kind of problems? Morrison asked. Tenant complaints that threatened to trigger city investigations, media inquiries about building conditions, legal action by tenant advocacy groups. Lieutenant Harrison's job was to ensure that none of these issues gained traction. Under cross-examination, Richardson tried to suggest that the payments were for legitimate consulting services, that Torino was simply paying for security expertise. But Walsh was prepared with evidence that demolished this defense. Mr. Richardson, she said calmly, legitimate security consultants don't typically meet their clients in abandoned parking lots at midnight. They don't receive payments in cash that are specifically designed to avoid banking regulations. And they don't use their official police authority to intimidate tenants who are trying to report legitimate safety concerns. The 5th day of the trial was when my father took the stand. He looked terrible. The cancer treatment had aged him dramatically in just a few weeks. His hair was thinner, his face gaunt, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone in chronic pain. But his voice was still strong when he was sworn in. His eyes were clear as he began his testimony. Morrison walked him through his career, establishing his credentials and authority before moving into the corruption charges. Lieutenant Harrison, how did your relationship with Vincent Torino begin? My father cleared his throat. In 2018, I was investigating a domestic violence call at one of his properties. The victim, a young woman named Lisa Martinez, had been severely beaten by her boyfriend. But when I interviewed her, She was more concerned about being evicted than she was about pressing charges.
Ow.
Why was she concerned about eviction? She said that Mr. Torino had a policy of evicting tenants who caused problems, including tenants. Who called the police? She begged me not to file a report because she was afraid of losing her apartment. What did you do? My father was quiet for a long moment. I told her I understood her situation, said I would talk to Mr. Torino about it. And did you? I met with him the next day, explained that evicting domestic violence victims could create legal problems for him, bad publicity, potential lawsuits. I suggested that it would be better for everyone if these situations could be handled more discreetly. What did Mr. Torino say? He thanked me for the advice. A week later, he called and asked if we could meet for lunch. He said he wanted to show his appreciation for my help. Morrison nodded. What happened at lunch? He gave me an envelope with $5,000 in cash. He said he knew police officers weren't paid what they were worth, and he wanted to make sure I was compensated for going above and beyond. Did you take the money? Yes. The word came out like a confession at a church. I took it. Why? My father looked at me for the first time since he'd started testifying, because I was angry. Angry at the department, angry at the city, angry at a system that expected me to solve everyone else's problems while barely paying me enough to support my own family. Carmen and I were talking about getting married, and I wanted to be able to offer her more than a cop's salary. So you continued taking payments from Mr. Torino? I did, every month for 5 years. In exchange, I made sure that complaints about his properties didn't result in serious investigations. I buried reports, discouraged tenants from pursuing legal action, and generally made their problems disappear. Morrison walked him through specific cases, forcing him to acknowledge each family he'd failed, each complaint he'd buried, each life he'd made worse through his corruption. But it was Richardson's cross-examination that revealed the full scope of my father's crimes. Lieutenant Harrison, was Vincent Torino the only person who paid you to ignore criminal activity?
Ow.
My father hesitated. No. How many other individuals or organizations paid you bribes during your career? Over the years, maybe a dozen. What kinds of criminal activity did you agree to ignore in exchange for these payments? Property crimes mostly? Some drug activity? Few cases involving illegal gambling? Illegal gambling? Or several. Unlicensed casinos operating in South Philadelphia. The operators paid me to ensure that raids were called off at the last minute, or that evidence would be lost if arrests were made. Richardson was building a defense that painted my father as so thoroughly corrupt that Torino could reasonably have believed his activities were sanctioned by law enforcement. But with each admission, my father was also revealing the true extent of his betrayal of everything his badge was supposed to represent. Lieutenant Harrison, approximately how much money did you receive in bribes during your career? Approximately $750,000. The number landed in the courtroom like a physical blow. I felt my vision blur as I processed what he'd just admitted. $750,000 in blood money, earned by protecting people who hurt families, who endangered children, who made life hell for the city's most vulnerable residents. And where is that money now? Most of it has been spent. Some was used to purchase a house, some for my wife's medical expenses when she was injured in the line of duty, some for general living expenses. What about the house you purchased for your current wife, Carmen Martinez Harrison? My father's face flushed. That house was purchased with legitimate savings, Lieutenant Harrison, according to financial records. You purchased that house for $420,000 paying cash. Your official salary at the time was $62,000 annually. Can you explain how you accumulated $420,000 in legitimate savings? The silence stretched on for nearly 30 seconds before my father answered, I cannot. When he stepped down from the witness stand, my father looked like a man who had just confessed to crimes against his own soul, which, in a way, he had. The prosecution rested their case after presenting testimony from financial experts, city inspectors, and more victims of Torino's negligence. The defense tried to argue that Torino had relied on police guidance, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, as Torino was led away in handcuffs. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and profound sadness. Justice had been served. But the cost had been the complete destruction of any illusions I'd maintained about my father's character. That evening, I received a call from Detective Walsh. "Your father wants to see you," she said. "He's being held at the county facility until his sentencing hearing next week. He asked if you'd visit him." I stared out the window of my apartment at the city I'd been trying to serve, thinking about all the families who would finally have justice, all the future victims who would be spared because of what we'd accomplished. "Tell him I'll think about it," I said. But even as I said the words, I knew I would go. It's not because I'd forgiven him and not because I thought he deserved my presence, but because there were still questions that needed answers, and because some conversations can only happen when everything else has been stripped away. The Philadelphia/Detention Center smelled like disinfectant and despair. I sat in the sterile visiting room, watching through reinforced glass as guards led my father to the chair across from me. He wore an orange jumpsuit that made his already pale complexion look almost ghostly. The cancer treatment had accelerated since the trial, and he moved with the careful, measured steps of someone whose body was betraying him. "Thank you for coming," he said, picking up the phone on his side of the glass partition. His voice was hoarse, weaker than it had been during his testimony just a week earlier. I almost didn't. I kept my voice neutral, professional. This wasn't a son visiting his father. This was a community advocate meeting with a criminal who had caused immeasurable harm to the people I'd devoted my life to helping. "I know." He coughed, a wet sound that suggested his condition was deteriorating rapidly. "The doctors say I have maybe 6 weeks left. The cancer has spread to my lungs and liver." I felt nothing at this news. No sadness, no relief, just the empty acknowledgement of a fact. "Is that why you wanted to see me? To talk about dying?" "Partly." He shifted in his chair, wincing with the movement. "But mostly I wanted to apologize. Really apologize, not the half-hearted attempt I made at dinner. Apologize to me or apologize for what you did to those families. Both. All of it." He leaned closer to the glass. "Daniel, I know you have no reason to believe me, but I need you to understand something. When I started taking money from Torino, I told myself it was temporary. Just enough to help Carmen with her medical bills after she was shot on duty. Just enough to get us started in our new life together. But it wasn't temporary. No, it wasn't. Because once you take that first payment, once you cross that line, everything changes. Every decision becomes about protecting what you've already done instead of doing what's right." I watched his face, looking for signs of manipulation, for the calculated charm he'd used to justify his actions for so many years. But all I saw was exhaustion and something that might have been genuine regret. I asked, "It's not even the money you took or the families you failed. It's that you were so good at it. You were so convincing, so righteous, so absolutely certain that you were serving justice while you were actually destroying it." He nodded slowly. "I was good at lying, to everyone, including myself." "What about Mom?" The question came out harder than I'd intended. "Was that a lie too? The way you told it at dinner? She killed herself because of your affair. But now I know you were taking bribes while you were married to her. Was she just another casualty of your corruption?"
His face
crumpled. "Your mother knew." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What?" "She knew about the money. Not the details, not the full extent, but she knew I was taking payments from people I was supposed to be investigating." I felt the room spinning around me. How long did she know? 3 years? Maybe 4? She found some of the cash I'd hidden in the garage, and she confronted me about it. I told her it was overtime pay that I was saving as a surprise for her birthday. But she didn't believe you. Your mother was smart. She started paying attention to my cases, reading the reports I brought home, asking questions about why certain investigations seemed to disappear. And gradually, she pieced together what was really happening. The full scope of my mother's tragedy was becoming clear. She hadn't just discovered her husband's affair, she'd discovered that he was a criminal, that their entire life together had been built on money stolen from the city's most vulnerable residents. That's why she started volunteering more at the community center, I said, the pieces falling into place. She was trying to help the same people you were hurting? Yes. His voice was barely a whisper. She said if she couldn't stop me from taking dirty money, at least she could try to balance the scales somehow. I thought about my mother in those final years, how she'd thrown herself into volunteer work with an intensity that had seemed almost desperate. I'd thought she was just finding purpose in helping others. I hadn't realized she was trying to atone for crimes she hadn't committed. She tried to get me to stop, he continued. Not just the affair, but all of it. She said we could start over. That she'd stand by me if I came clean and made things right. But you didn't. I was too scared, too proud. I was convinced that I could manage everything, keep all the pieces in the air. I thought I could end the affair, reduce the payments, and gradually transition back to being an honest cop. Instead, you got deeper in. Instead, I got deeper in. And your mother got more desperate. She started talking about going to internal affairs herself, about exposing everything if I wouldn't. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. So you made sure she couldn't. He looked up sharply. What do you mean? I mean that maybe she didn't kill herself. Maybe someone else decided she was becoming too much of a liability. His face went white. Daniel, no, that's not. I would. Never, ... wouldn't you? You've already admitted to destroying evidence, intimidating witnesses, protecting criminals who hurt children. Would murder really be such a stretch? I loved your mother. You loved yourself more. We sat in silence for several minutes. The weight of everything unsaid hanging between us like a fog. Finally, he spoke again. There's something else you need to know. About the money, about what's going to happen to it. The court already ordered asset forfeiture. Every dollar you stole is going back to the city. Not every dollar. He reached into his jumpsuit pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I had an account you didn't know about. Carmen didn't know about it either. An account I opened in 2019, where I deposited 20% of every payment I received. He slid the paper through the small slot beneath the glass partition. It was a bank statement showing an account balance of over $150,000. I told myself it was insurance money, in case everything fell apart. But really, I think I always knew that someday I'd need to make restitution, and I wanted to have something to give back. I stared at the statement. Why are you showing me this? 'Cause I'm signing it over to you, the account, all of it. To use however you think will do the most good. I don't want your blood money. It's not for you. It's for them. It's the families we hurt, the kids who got sick in Torino's buildings, the elderly tenants who suffered because of my corruption. He leaned forward urgently. Daniel, you've spent 5 years trying to help people with grants and volunteer work. Imagine what you could do with $150,000 in direct aid. The number was staggering. It represented more money than I'd managed to raise through grants in all my years of community work combined. Money that could fund after-school programs, provide emergency housing assistance, pay for medical care for families who couldn't afford it. There's one condition, he added. I want you to make sure Maria Santos gets $20,000. Her kids were the ones who got sick from the mold in Torino's building. I know it won't undo the damage, but maybe it will help them get the medical care they need. I thought about Maria, how she'd testified with such quiet dignity about watching her children struggle with respiratory problems caused by the toxic conditions in their apartment. How she'd trusted the system to protect her family, only to be betrayed by the very people who were supposed to serve and protect. And James Washington, my father continued, the man whose ceiling collapsed. He lost everything he owned in that flood. $10,000 won't replace his belongings, but maybe it will help him find a decent place to live. He knew their names. He knew their stories. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw evidence that he understood the human. Cost of his actions? There's a list, he said. Every family I can remember who suffered because of what I did. I wrote down their names, their situations, what I think they need most. It's not complete. No, I hurt more people than I can remember, but it's a start. He pulled out another folded paper and passed it through the slot. The list was 3 pages long, written in his careful handwriting. Each entry included a name, an address, a brief description of how his corruption had affected them, and a suggested amount of financial assistance. I read through the list, recognizing many of the names from my own community work. These were families I'd helped during emergencies, people I'd connected with social services, kids I'd tutored and mentored. My father's crimes had created the very problems I'd been trying to solve. I know it's not enough, he said. Money can't undo the harm I caused. It can't bring back your mother, can't give those families the years of decent housing they deserve, can't erase the corruption from the police department. Then why offer it? Because that's all I have left. Because maybe if you can use this money to help even a few of the people I hurt, and something good can come from all this destruction. I folded the papers and put them in my jacket pocket. I'll think about it. There's one more thing. He was coughing again, harder this time. Carmen doesn't know about any of this. Not the account, not the list, not the full extent of what I did. When she married me, she thought she was marrying a decorated police officer, not a criminal. Was taking bribes too. The prosecutor made that clear. Small amounts. Payments to look the other way on drug cases that intersected with my corruption. She thought we were just being pragmatic, bending the rules to get better results. He paused. She's not a bad person, Daniel. She's just someone who trusted the wrong man, like Mom did. Like your mother did. A guard approached and tapped on the glass, indicating that visiting time was almost over. My father nodded and turned back to me. I know I don't have the right to ask this, but I need you to understand something. The man who raised you, the one who taught you about right and wrong, about service and sacrifice, that man was real. He wasn't lying or performing. He was who I wanted to be, who I tried to be before I lost my way. But he wasn't who you actually were. No, he wasn't. But maybe he's who you became. He pressed his palm against the glass. Everything you've done, all the people you've helped, the career you've built, that's the man I should have been. You took the best parts of what I taught you and made them real in ways I never could. The guard was signaling more insistently now. My father stood up slowly, his movements painful and labored. Will you come back? He asked. Before the end. I looked at this man who had given me life and then spent 28 years, disappointing me in ways both large and small, who had taught me about justice while practicing corruption, who had spoken about family values while destroying his own family, who had worn a badge that represented everything he'd betrayed. I don't know, I said honestly. I understand. He picked up the phone one last time. Daniel, I'm proud of who you became. I know I don't have the right to be proud, but I am. You're a better man than I ever was. I know, I said, and hung up the phone. 3 weeks later, my father died in the prison medical unit. I didn't attend his funeral, the small ceremony, Carmen, organized for a handful of police officers who still remembered him as a colleague rather than a criminal. Instead, I spent that day at the Hartwell Community Center, meeting with families who would receive assistance from what I'd started calling the Restoration Fund. Maria Santos cried when I handed her the check for $20,000. Youngest son had been hospitalized twice for asthma attacks triggered by mold exposure. The money would pay for the specialized medical care he needed. James Washington used his $10,000 as a down payment on a small house in a safe neighborhood. The first stable home he'd had in years. But the most meaningful conversation was with Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman whose apartment had been without heat for 3 winters because my father had buried her complaints about her landlord. Your father, she said in halting English, he was not a good man. No, I agreed. He wasn't. But you are a good man. You help when he does not help. I'm trying to. She patted my hand with her weathered fingers. Good man fix what bad man broke. This is how the world will get better. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new office in City Hall, reviewing proposals for expanded community programs. The Restoration Fund had grown beyond the money my father left behind. Other police officers convicted in the corruption scandal had been ordered to make restitution. Several city council members had allocated additional funds to address the systemic problems that had allowed the corruption to flourish. My assistant knocked on the door. Daniel, there's someone here to see you. She says she was at your father's retirement party. Detective Carmen Martinez Harrison entered my office, looking nothing like the confident woman I remembered from that night. She was thinner, older, wearing civilian clothes that suggested she was no longer with the police department. "Mrs. Martinez," I said, standing to shake her hand, "I heard you were testifying in the ongoing corruption cases. I've told the prosecutors everything I know," which it turns out wasn't very much. She sat down across from my desk. I came to apologize. For what? For being blind? For trusting Bobby when I should have asked more questions? For taking money I knew it was suspicious, but told myself it was harmless? She looked directly at me. For being the reason your mother suffered? I'd spent months processing my anger toward this woman, but sitting across from her now, I felt only sadness. She looked like another victim of my father's corruption, someone who'd been manipulated and used just like everyone else he'd touched. Lead to all of us," I said finally. "You, me, Mom, the families he was supposed to protect. That's what corruption does. It spreads like poison until everyone it touches is damaged. Your mother was a good woman. She tried to help me when I was shot, even though she knew about Bobby and me. Brought food to the hospital, sat with me when Bobby was working. I never understood why she was so kind to someone who was destroying her marriage, because that's who she was. She helped people who needed help, even when it hurt her to do it." Carmen nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. "I've left the force. I'm going back to school to become a social worker. I want to try to help people. The right way this time. Good. The city needs more people who understand what it means to serve others." She stood to leave, then turned back. "Daniel, your father talked about you constantly, especially near the end after he got sick. He said you were the only thing in his life he'd done right." "He was wrong about that too," I said. "I did that myself." After she left, I walked to the window of my office and looked out over the city I'd committed my life to serving. Somewhere out there, families were living in safe housing because slumlords could no longer pay police to ignore violations. Children were getting medical care because corruption money had been returned to the community. Elderly residents were receiving social services because the system was finally working the way it was supposed to. My father's retirement party seemed like a lifetime ago. It's that moment when he'd stood before 200 people and called me his biggest mistake. I'd walked out of that room humiliated and angry, convinced that I'd never measure up to his expectations. Now I understood that his expectations had been corrupt from the beginning, that the man I'd spent my life trying to please had been a criminal, who'd built his reputation on the suffering of others. The biggest mistake hadn't been met, had been him. Every choice he'd made that prioritized money over justice, personal gain over public service, but his mistakes had taught me something valuable about the kind of person I wanted to be. Not perfect, not without flaws, but someone who used whatever influence I had to make life better for people who needed help. Someone who understood that true strength came from lifting others up, not from tearing them down. The phone on my desk rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Detective Walsh, calling to update me on the next phase of prosecutions in the corruption scandal. "Daniel," she said, "we need your help again. We've uncovered evidence of corruption in the housing authority, and we think some of the families you've worked with might be willing to testify." "Of course," I said. "What do you need?" "Meet me tomorrow at 10. And Daniel, bring your list of community contacts. We're going to need all the help we can get to clean up this mess." I hung up the phone and smiled. My father had left me more than money in that prison account. He had left me a mission. Not the one he'd intended, perhaps, but the one I'd chosen. For myself, every family we helped, every corrupt official we exposed, every system we reformed was proof that good people could overcome the damage caused by bad ones, that communities could heal from betrayal, that justice could eventually prevail, and that sometimes the greatest service you can provide is simply refusing to become the person who failed you. I picked up the phone to call Maria Santos. Her son had been accepted into a specialized treatment program for children with environmental asthma, and I wanted to congratulate her. It was a small victory in a larger war against corruption and neglect, but it was real, and it mattered. And for the first time since that retirement party, I felt proud of the man I'd become, not because my father had finally approved, but because I'd learned to approve of myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.